Hello and welcome back to the Trend Micro Vision 1 demo series. I'm your host, Shannon Murphy, the czar of XDR and a member of the product marketing team here at Trend. During these live bi-monthly demos, our experts will highlight new and popular XDR capabilities, apps, and features available within the console. Super quick note, for March, we actually have 3 sessions instead of just 2, with the next 2 coming up on the 17th and the 31st. I'm so excited for today's session. I've been talking about it for 2 weeks to anyone who would listen. Today, we're covering an extremely highly requested feature that has taken over the Q&A box in every demo session this year, and that feature is automated response. To give you a super quick overview, automated response allows you to automatically respond to critical alerts and events to speed up response time and minimize the impact scope. As always, before I turn it over to Danny, I'll quickly touch on some housekeeping items. Today, our subject matter expert is Danny Asaban. He will wrap up before the half hour is over, so we'll have time to answer any questions you may have. And at any time, please feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, just helps us triage them a little bit better. And we'll do our best to get to them at the end of the session. Without any further hesitation, let's see what it looks like in the product, Danny.
All right, Shannon, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening in from. My name is Danny Asaban. I'm a sales engineer with Trend Micro, based out of New York, and I support our Northeast region. So today's topic for this demo series is going to be a newly released feature available in Vision 1, and that is automated response. And it's funny, actually, last season, I think when I spoke at the Vision 1 demo series, I spoke about response management and the different response tasks that are available within the console. So I'm excited to show where we're going in terms of automating some of those tasks for us. But I do know we have a diverse audience today. Perhaps everyone's not as familiar with Vision 1 as others. So I'll just like to introduce it really as a whole, and then we could jump into the console and we'll talk about the automated response. So just real quick, from a super high level, when we're answering or being asked what the heck is Vision 1, simply put, Trend Micro's extended detection and response platform. And it's really that idea of it as a platform that I hope you take away. When I interact with the solution, I really find XDR is just a category of applications available to me. And hopefully throughout these demo series, you've got a chance to learn about those additional applications that are available. For example, the sandbox analysis or the risk insights or these zero trust secure access, and how they all really contribute to that XDR approach when we're talking security. In terms of how it works, just from a super high level, it does utilize the sensors deployed to different components of your environment. And that idea of extending beyond just the endpoint, and of course we'll have that covered as well, but consider your data center environment, whatever that might look like, if you're on-prem, in the cloud, or perhaps a hybrid. And we'll also talk about some other high-value sensors on the email and network side of the house, and specifically how they help us in terms of response and how we could automate some of those response tasks. But just going back to how it works, again, from a super high level, what these sensors do are collect activity data from their respective components and act as a feed to XDR's data lake. In the data lake is where the analysis and correlation occurs. And what's returned to the user in the console is what we call a workbench. And that's just a graphical presentation of the incident at hand. And we'll see what that looks like shortly. What I should mention as well is there is a managed service you could layer on top of this, basically offering Trend Analyst monitoring the environment as well. But going back to this idea of sensors and extending beyond the endpoint, let me suggest maybe 20 years ago, when we found a computer that had malware, was infected, what was our process? We'd try to clean the machine, maybe run a couple AV scans on it. Maybe it was quick and easy enough for us to accomplish. We'd re-image it, get it back out in the field, and call it a day. Unfortunately, today, I think it's as I'm sure we're all aware, it's a much different story. I would say what was being done 20 years ago today might just be an indication of perhaps a much larger incident that maybe we're just not seeing or looking in the right place in order for us to contextualize. So some questions right off the bat that we would want to answer when running an investigation. and something to even consider from a higher level, is how did this threat enter my environment? Do I understand that? And more importantly, am I currently at risk? Am I currently under attack? Is there an incident happening in my environment right now that I'm just not aware of? Think internal propagation, for example, and spread. Are other machines being infected? And so on. And we'll see how two specific sensors available in Vision 1 kind of really contribute to that idea. So we'll look at the email sensor, and I think it is quite unique for us, but just revisiting from a super high level, what that threat vector on the email side of the house looks like for any organization. We know by far the number one threat vector. We see close to 95% of malware is really introduced to a system through email. So our email sensor, I think, is quite unique in the fact that it's really an API integration to the mailbox level. But when trying to answer why is that important for us, we should consider that it's sitting after any gateway solutions. So of course, email gateways and email filtering and web filtering gateway solutions are a very important piece to that layered approach towards security. But more importantly, what it means for us at Trend and what that API integration supports is us to respond to the mailbox level as well. And that will commonly look like maybe quarantining or deleting a malicious or suspicious piece of mail from a user's mailbox, for example. On the network side of things, what I'm actually seeing more and more of in my conversations with customers is that the internal traffic is more often than not a blind spot for an organization. We invest a lot in those next-gen firewalls, but unfortunately, that doesn't help me see what's propagating or potentially spreading within my environment. So the telemetry provided from our network sensor, I think, really offers that level insight in understanding, is this compromised machine propagating in my environment, and what those external communications look like. Is it calling out to some malicious command and control server? Is it downloading some additional payloads to carry out the remainder of its attack, for example? And we'll see how these two sensors in specific help us in terms of automating some of these response tasks. But I did mention the workbench. So for those not familiar, I do want to just share a quick snip of what that looks like. And if there's one thing I hope you take away is that when looking at the larger story of the incident at whole, many objects can and should be identified as a part of that story. The 2 cents I just want to share here and what I find most valuable is when going through my IR process and running my investigations is the quick ability to pivot my investigation. Perhaps I want to focus on just that suspicious email that may have introduced a threat to my environment, or I'm more concerned of what that lateral movement looks like on the network side of things. And hopefully some earlier demos, I think we shared the search app, and hopefully you got a chance to see just how versatile that search app is in supporting that need to pivot my investigations accordingly. But when looking at the workbench, what I'll suggest is we just take a deeper dive into what these objects are and why is that important when it comes time for us to talk response. There's this concept of being contextually aware of the objects being identified in a workbench. And I think this is really important because only if an object is appropriately identified can the appropriate response technique be deployed and where we're going in terms of automating that response task. So from a super high level, take perhaps a compromised machine that you're investigating in your environment. Something you commonly might want to do is isolate that from the local network as you carry out your investigation. While on the email side of things, for example, a suspicious email that may have introduced some threat to my environment, I might want to quarantine or delete from my user's mailbox, again, as I'm carrying out my investigation. And here we just see a number of some of the response tasks that are available and have been available on the workbench today. And again, you see from the screenshots, you could respond directly from the workbench, and we're going to talk about how some of these steps are actually automated for us. So I think that's enough of the recap on the PowerPoints for what Vision 1 is as a whole. So if you will allow me, let's just jump into the console real quick, and I'll share that for us. And as I'm pulling this up, I would just ask that we have some things in the back of our minds when we're looking at what is the value of automating some of these response tasks and what does it bring to my team and my organization. So those 3 things I would ask for you guys to consider is number 1, time. Does this allow me to respond faster when I'm thinking mean time to response, mean time to remediation? Number 2, I'd ask consider containment. does this allow me to potentially contain the spread or propagation of a threat in my environment? And lastly, the idea of extending your team. I'm sure we're all familiar with the limited resources we have at hand, but something I've actually experienced personally is not only my limited resources right in front of me, but the larger team that I might have to engage with in terms of my IR process. And I like to call this the where the heck's my exchange admin moment. In a previous life before Trend, I was an infrastructure engineer and I had the pleasure of working there during a ransomware attack. And I see one of our security analysts running down the hall, shouting, "Where the heck's John? We need to respond something in exchange." So let me suggest that no longer would be a limitation with the larger team that you might have to engage in your response process. We can now respond directly from the workbench, and we'll see shortly how we can automate that as well. So just want to make sure, I think you should see the Vision One console up. What I do like to show here is just a quick reminder for maybe the larger security operations teams out there, the custom scripting that is available. So very often during IR processes, there's some initial steps that regardless of the incident that I have to carry out anyways. And often we'll script those processes just to make life a little bit easier for us. So we do have the option is to have that uploaded into your Vision One instance via PowerShell or Bash scripts. And I like to call this being locked and loaded, so to speak. When I'm investigating a workbench, if I determine the need to run one of these scripts, I could do that directly from the workbench on whatever asset I had in question. Keep in mind that does require the investigation and the workbench and for the user to initiate this custom script on your assets. But what we have available now when we jump into XDR's workbenches is this automated response feature up here. So let's click into that and we'll try to make sense of this. But first, just looking at the workflow, as we may already be aware, a detection model is triggered on the back end, which creates the workbench. And that is standard across the board, regardless if you enable automation or not. However, should you enable semi or full automation, what will happen to the workbench on the back end is an automated threat investigation. And as you saw on some of the slides of the different objects identified within a workbench, the automated threat investigation, again, run on the back end, would analyze these different objects and potentially classify them as either suspicious or highly suspicious. And you see some of the response tasks available with each classification. So on the suspicious side, we would have the ability to potentially collect a file or quarantine an email. And highly suspicious adds the additional tasks of potentially adding something to a block list or isolating an endpoint from the local network. What we do have available as well is to submit these SOs, these suspicious objects, to the sandbox analysis, which is just, again, another application available within the platform. I will mention if that is something you're looking to incorporate, you will want to make sure you have some Vision One credits allocated for the sandboxing. Now, in terms of configurations of the automated response, I just hope looking at the screen, you say, heck, that looks pretty freaking easy in terms to configure, which it absolutely is. So looking at the no automation, again, doesn't change the fact that the detection model will trigger and it'll create the workbench. But when you have semi or full automation enabled, the automated threat investigation will go ahead and run the analysis on the back end and identify these suspicious or potentially highly suspicious objects. So let's just quickly understand what the difference is between semi-automation versus full automation. What they both have in common is they'll both create the response task and queue it up under response management. Semi-automation will require administrator's approval to execute that response task, while full automation, the response task is executed on our behalf. So quite simple when we think about it, and now we can talk about what that experience is. So let's focus on that semi-automation example, and we could see what it would look like in your environment. And I'd actually go as far as suggesting that might actually, that experience actually starts on the email side of the house. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of the notifications that Vision One does send out. For example, when a workbench is created, you have a quick recap of what that workbench identifier is, what the detection model that was triggered, what its severity, as well as the scope. But we're more concerned about the automated response notification email. So again, bearing in mind that this is done under semi-automation and will require a user's approval, let's take a look at this. Again, I have a workbench that was created, referenced here, but I'm more concerned about the response task details. And I see the investigation yielded it identified a suspicious URL that it wants to block. Again, semi-automation is not going to block it on my behalf. It'll require my approval. So looking at this, I'll just hit this link in the email, and that should take me directly to the response management screen where I have that task pending. And we'll give this a moment to load. And just like we saw in the email, I have the task created by automated response with the workbench referenced. Again, we see the SO, in this case, the URL, wanting to add it to the block list. Because it's semi-automation, it's not going to execute. I have the ability to approve this task right here. But looking at this, I say, I've never seen that URL in my life. I can't just go ahead and block it. Allow me to investigate. So what I'll do is click into the workbench, and let's see if we could just piece together that story. So here's a nice example where I see actually email and network activity, as well as endpoint activity for that matter. And I'm more concerned about the URL that Vision 1 is suggesting I add to my block list. And I see that identified right here. Looking at this workbench, what I'll quickly notice is there's a network analytics report available. So that'll help me understand what is exactly triggering on my network sensor and why it doesn't like this URL. So allow me to take a look at that. And the network sensor, for those that are familiar, is actually our deep discovery inspector. So looking at the IOC in this case, I see, yep, that URL is identified here. And the deep discovery inspector, my network sensor, web reputation service has triggered. This is a known malicious URL, in this case categorized as phishing. That's enough for me. I'm confident to respond. Allow me to jump back to the workbench. In this case, I'll go back to automated response and say, I've investigated the workbench. I concur. Allow me to approve and add this suspicious URL to my block list. And that's the experience with the semi-automated response within XDR. And let's just take a look at one more example, and this one will actually be full automation. And again, I'll suggest it starts really on the email side of the house. I imagine not every user is living in the console all day, every day. So we can see what this one looks like. And again, we mentioned this is full automation, so it executed on our behalf. Again, I have the workbench notification email. I'm not as concerned about that. I want to see what the response tasks are. Again, we have a similar detection model. I have the severity and the scope, or rather the identifier of the workbench. But when looking at the response task details, I see the automated threat investigation identified 2 suspicious objects. In this case, one in email, and again, another suspicious URL. Because it was done on full automation, these 2 tasks were executed already. So if I want to jump back into Vision 1 and just take a look at the workbench, again, we'll try to make sense of the story. And it should look a bit similar, but perhaps maybe more objects identified in this workbench. And again, we see a lot going on. I'm having some difficulty understanding what the heck's going on here. What I always suggest is if you select the detection model within the workbench, you'll see the associated objects to the detection model highlighted. So I could quickly decipher, I have this external Yahoo sender sending this mail object to one of my high profile users. I'll also see that email contains that suspicious URL. But as I'm investigating, what I'll also notice is I see it looks like that suspicious mail, that final test email, exists in 2 additional users' mailboxes in my environment. Okay, so that's good. And I could also maybe just to reference that idea of quickly pivoting my investigation, and this will take me directly to the search app if I do want to just focus on the email activity. But we're looking at the incident as a whole and the automated response tasks that were created for us. So I've already investigated the URL. I understand it's a SO to be added to my block list. Okay, so I understand the story here from a high level. Let me jump back to the automated response here and see what exactly was done. Just like we saw in the workbench, our email sensor, our cloud app security solution, for those that are familiar, did identify that malicious piece of mail in 3 mailboxes in my environment, and under fully automated response, successfully quarantined the messages from all affected mailboxes. Again, on the network side, I identified the suspicious URL and added that to the block lists. And we'll jump over to suspicious object management just to confirm that as well. So we'll give a quick search for that URL. I see it is here, it was added, and if you click on that, you can see automated response did add this URL to my SO list and had the action as block. And that is the experience with full automation with automated response in XDR. What I'd suggest also is we could take that one step further for those organizations that are using Zero Trust Secure Access today, or perhaps are familiar with the risk insights available in Vision 1. So if we jump into there, and I should mention this is in preview today, but it should be available to everyone. But what we have under secure access rules are now risk control oriented rules. So we'll look at one quick example, and then just to mention, these are available templates built into the console. You always have the ability to create your own as well. But just for the sake of example, we'll look at a simple one for us. And this is really just notifying on a user with a high risk score. And again, this is thanks to the Zero Trust Risk Insights application, again, available within the platform. But looking at the configurations real quick, we see we'll just turn it on. I want this applied to all my users all the time. But here I could define some things for my organization. So I might consider a high risk threshold or risk tolerance. I might want to up my score for when this triggers from, I think 70 might be the default. But again, I have high tolerance, I'm going to up this to 80. And I want this to trigger whenever it's matched. So now once this rule is matched, what actions do I want to apply? In this case, I'm focused on users. So I'll allow them to continue to connect to the secure access module or perhaps access some cloud-based resources. But in terms of my business or mission critical applications that I have running that I've configured under private access, those I might want to hold off on my high risk users accessing. So here we see you could block that, and we'll see shortly what those logs look like. Lastly, in terms of automation, we do have the ability to revoke some of these limitations or actions where enforcing on users for security should their risk score drop behind your predefined risk tolerance, for example. So looking at the rules, or the logs rather, real quick, what I'll do is just filter this by those risk control rules, and just to make life a bit easy for us, search for this suspicious guy over here. And let's see a bit more than this. Okay, and just like we saw in those risk control rules, I've allowed the user to continue to log in, perhaps access some cloud-based resources. But if I scroll down a bit, I have this is the email address associated with this user. I see that was the credentials used to try to access an internal application, one of those mission critical things I want to secure, and again, configured under private access. So looking at this, I see my Deep Discovery Analyzer, for example, that's what I have configured here. And hovering over this, I see it did block this user from access. So just to have some further insight and see the alignment with the secure access rules, or rather the risk control rules that we had configured. Again, I have my user identified as high risk. And just like we saw in the configuration, what actions did I allow and limit this user to obtain? So cloud access, yep, we allowed resource to Outlook, for example, as we saw in the logs. Perhaps continue to log into the Zero Trust module or the secure access module on this user's endpoint. But again, those mission critical applications I need to hold off on, and I'm going to keep that blocked. And lastly, on the endpoint side of things, we see here's the user that was logged in on the secure access module. And when looking at the notifications, to be more simple, I see my access to this application is blocked because I'm currently under high risk. And those are the two directions you'll see with automated response, both within XDR in and of itself, and how we're expanding that to Zero Trust Secure Access module.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Danny, for the demo. Really brought us through, at every little nook and cranny of that feature, and, some other great features within the product as well. So thank you so much for that. I do have a few questions for you. Starting with a really easy one, is automated response feature already available for all existing customers?
Yes, it should be. If you just jump into your workbench view in XDR, you should see the new feature enabled up top.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much. Next question here. How can we implement automated response for a few users for testing first and then enable it for all systems? Is that available?
And could you limit within the XDR application, when we saw the configuration here, you can't specify users for this to trigger on. What you can do is on the zero trust side that you could configure on a per user basis.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Next question here, a little bit more springboarding off of that question. Can we make endpoint exclusions for full automation? So for example, if you wouldn't want to isolate a domain controller as easily, is there an exclusion option?
That is a very good question. I believe if we jump here, we come back here. And if you come under detection models, that's a very good question because the limitation I think that's being asked for is just in the automated response aspect and not the detection models as a whole. So I don't believe it would be appropriate to add that as an exception here, but we could get some clarification and definitely get back to you on that.
Super. Thanks so much. Next question here. Is the block list shared by both Apex One and Cloud One? So for example, if a bad URL is detected on an endpoint, would it then be blocked for both client and server estates?
Yes, it would. Oh, I'm sorry. The sharing of suspicious objects. So let's just clarify, when we're doing the automated response within Vision 1, we'll see some of those tasks add to the suspicious objects. So in Cloud One, I believe, and I'll need Tim to keep me honest here, but I believe it's dependent on if you're running the XES sensor or just using the Cloud One workload security agent. If you are running the XES sensor in conjunction with the Cloud One workload security agent, yes, that would absolutely be supported. Moving forward, we are looking to that integration to share the SO list with Cloud One workload security.
Okay, super. Thank you. Next question here. We just have 3 minutes left on the clock. Are people, users, customers able to customize automatic response beyond the highly suspicious and then the partial or full automation?
So this is currently how it stands today and what's available to customers today. I can only imagine we'll see more supported customization moving forward. But as it stands today, this is what's available.
Super, thank you. Another quick question here, just clarification. Is this offered via cloud solution or on-prem?
So regardless, Vision 1 is going to be a SaaS solution. If you're looking at the integration of your on-premise products, perhaps that we would have to fine tune that. But if you're running, if you have the endpoints enabled, it would be a SaaS deployment, but obviously supporting your on-prem assets.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. And then I think this may be our last one. How is it possible to block the access to an application? Does the customer need DDI or maybe some more clarification around which method is being used to block access?
Okay, so that's really our Zero Trust Secure Access module. This is in preview, which does make it available for free for all existing Vision 1 users today. I guess real quick, just the configuration of this, if you are looking to limit access to those internal resources under a configuration, you would just want to define what those applications are. This does require an on-prem appliance. In this case, we call it our connector group. And that's what just provides the rules for the accesses as you define. So you would deploy this, you would configure your internal applications that you're looking to secure, and then you'll have the different rule templates available for you either for private example. For example, you could see I might want to block one user from one application, but keeping in mind what that zero trust approach is in general, by default, it's block everybody regardless. And then you'll configure your allow lists or if you have any specific block list you want to implement. And those would be default rules. And then we spoke about the risk control rules that are a bit more dynamic in terms of relation to what the risk threat or what the risk score is for either the user or asset.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. We are right at just about at 11:30 here. I see there are a few more questions left in the queue. If we weren't able to get to, please follow up either with your sales rep or respond to the follow-up email that I will send later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. Just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and of course, thank you so much, Danny, for walking us through this today.